In this paper, my aim will be to explore Foucault's analysis of the relations between Parrhēsia and rhetoric in more detail. To complicate it, indeed, as I will show, Foucault doesn't always neatly distinguish the two, and to defend it from some of the main criticisms it has received so far. My claim will be that Foucault's views on this topic get progressively clearer and more convincing, and that it is only in 1984, in The Courage of Truth, when explicitly taking up the perspective of the perlocutionary effect, notion that I will come back to in the talk. So it is only at that moment in 1984 that Foucault is able to neatly distinguish Parrhēsia from rhetoric. Okay, so in On the Government of Self and Others, 1983, Foucault defines Parrhēsia as a non-artificial way of speaking. Parrhēsia, he says, is direct, clear, and transparent. In short, he claims it is rhetoric degree 0. In his letter 75 to Lucilius, Seneca clearly emphasizes this crucial feature of Parrhēsia. Just like in unaffected and easygoing conversation, Seneca writes, there is nothing mannered or artificial about my letters because, quote, if it were possible, I would like to let you see my thoughts rather than translate them into language. Thus, Parrhēsia can be characterized as a way to let the interlocutor see one's thoughts, the speaker's thoughts, without embellishing them through an elegant rhetorical style or altering them using oratorical tricks. Parrhēsia aims to convey the thought purely and simply with the minimum embellishment compatible with this transparency, as Foucault explains in the hermeneutics of the subject. This, however, raises a lot of delicate issues. Indeed, as Arthur Walser polemically argues in a paper from 2013, Foucault favors unartful and bold forms of Parrhēsia, and as a consequence, it seems to reduce rhetoric to flattery in order to simply exclude the rhetorical aspects of Parrhēsia from his analysis. Yet, according to Walser, this is historically and philologically illegitimate. Rhetoric and Parrhēsia cannot and should not be entirely pulled apart, because throughout history, the latter has more often than not taken on a rhetorical character. Leaving aside this question, as I'm not competent enough to address it, I would like to note that other ancient philosophy scholars, such as Pat Gerke, in their responses to Walser, have argued, I think convincingly, that at least within the context of the Athenian democracy, when speaking as Parrhēsiastes, one does not speak as rhetor or via the techne of rhetoric, and that more generally the ancient Greeks understood and used the two terms, Parrhēsia and rhetoric, as denoting two different verbal activities. But once again, kind of leaving aside the philological question of retracing the historical relationships between Parrhēsia and rhetoric, which once again, I'm not competent to do. What I want to show is that Foucault's analyses are actually subtler and far more complex than what Walser suggests when criticizing them. And perhaps this will be actually helpful to get a better grip on Foucault's project and what he wants to do when he talks about ancient Parrhēsia. So in 1982, the first year in which the theme of Parrhēsia shows up in Foucault's work, Foucault addresses the issue of Parrhēsia's alleged transparency within the context of the traditional polemic opposing philosophy and rhetoric in antiquity. He argues that while rhetoric is, quote, the inventory and analysis of the means by which one can act on others by means of discourse, philosophy can be defined as, quote, the set of principles and practices available to one, or which one makes available to others for taking proper care of oneself or of others, end quote. Even though there appears to be an overlap here, for it seems necessary that in order to realize its objective, i.e. taking proper care of oneself or of others, philosophy as a discourse makes use of rhetoric. Foucault immediately points out that philosophical discourse always strives to tell the truth, whereas rhetoric is indifferent to the truth, its essential goal being persuasion. And I quote Foucault here from the Hermeneutics of the Subject, quote, "Rhetoric is first of all defined as a technique whose methods obviously do not aim to establish a truth. Rhetoric is defined as an art of persuading those to whom one is speaking, whether one wishes to convince them of a truth or a lie, a non-truth. Aristotle's definition in the Rhetoric is clear. It is the ability to find that which is capable of persuading. The question of the content and the question of the truth of the discourse delivered do not arise," end quote. However, Foucault is aware that the relations between philosophy and rhetoric are more complex and nuanced than the relations between philosophy and flattery, or philosophy and sophistry. Indeed, philosophical discourse clearly has its own materiality, Foucault says, its own plasticity, and thus also its own rhetoric, on which its effects depend, at least in part. To deny this would mean to contradict Foucault's own remarks a few years earlier about the concepts of game and regime of truth, and treat philosophy as a pure game of truth existing outside of all regimes. I can come back to this in the Q&A, of course, if you're interested. Thus, in the Hermeneutics of the Subject, Foucault defines parrhēsia within the context of the philosophical practice of spiritual direction in the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. So he defines parrhēsia within that context as, quote, that kind of appropriate rhetoric or non-rhetorical rhetoric which philosophical discourse must employ, end quote. And Foucault continues, quote, "Parrhēsia is the necessary form of philosophical discourse, since when we employ the logos, there is necessarily a lexis, a way of saying things, and the choice of particular words rather than others. Therefore, there can be no philosophical logos without this kind of body of language with its own qualities, its own figures, and its own necessary effects at the level of pathos. But if you are a philosopher, it is not the art or techne of rhetoric that is needed to control these elements. It must be this other thing, which is both a technique and an ethics, an art and a morality, and which is called parrhēsia," end quote. In other words, I think that Foucault here is suggesting that, at least in the context of the practice of spiritual direction in Roman philosophy, parrhēsia is different from rhetoric because it is not merely a technique or an art of discourse aiming at persuasion, but also an ethics. The spiritual director makes use of it in order to take proper care of his directees, i.e. to help them acquire autonomy and self-mastery. This is why the master's discourse must not be an artificial sham discourse subservient to the rules of rhetoric, seeking only to produce effects of pathos in the disciple's soul, but should be such that the disciple can autonomously subjectify it. Parrhēsia, as a techne employed by philosophical discourse in the context of the ancient practice of spiritual direction, aims to define a set of rules, rules of prudence, rules of skill, kairos, which do not pertain to the truth of the master's discourse, but to the way in which this discourse of truth is formulated. Yet it cannot be equated to rhetoric because it is not indifferent to the truth, and it does not aim to persuade, but rather to give form to a discourse of truth that is supposed to help the disciple to autonomously take care of himself. And let me briefly note here that this characterization of Parrhēsia as both a technique and an ethics marks a significant shift from what Foucault argues in his 1980 lectures at Berkeley and Dartmouth College. There, Foucault claims that the spiritual director's discourse possesses a rhetorical quality in that the truth that it is supposed to convey is obtained by, quote, a rhetorical explanation of what is good for anyone who wants to approach the life of a sage. In other words, the master's discourse is characterized by a persuasive rhetoric, and Foucault goes so far in 1980 as to claim that all the ancient technologies of the self are closely connected, not only with the art of memory, but also with the art of persuasion. So I think you already see a clear shift from 1980 to 1982, in which Foucault wants to mark a more clear difference between this new way that he has to characterize the philosophical discourse in antiquity through the notion of Parrhēsia, and where he tries to actually distinguish Parrhēsia clearly from the art of persuasion, although you still have this kind of, you still see Foucault kind of working with these, in a certain way, ambiguous formulation, the idea that Parrhēsia is a non-rhetorical rhetoric, right? He's still struggling with how to make sense of this relationship. So back to 1982, rather than Parrhēsia's mortal enemy, which is flattery, rhetoric is presented by Foucault in the hermeneutics of the subject as both its technical adversary and its technical partner. So there's this kind of double role that rhetoric plays in relation to Parrhēsia. Parrhēsia must detach itself from rhetoric, not in order to get rid of it once and for all, according to Foucault, but in order to be able to make use of it within strict, always tactically defined limits where it is really necessary, Foucault writes or says. Indeed, as opposed to rhetoric, Parrhēsia is what allows the transmission of true discourse in all its naked force from master to disciple. It is, in other words, one of the main instruments through which, in antiquity, philosophical truth was given force. In the hermeneutics of the subject, the relationship between Parrhēsia and rhetoric is thus portrayed as a complex, nuanced, ambiguous, and ultimately strategic one. Quote, in its structure, in its game, the discourse of Parrhēsia is completely different from rhetoric, Foucault says. This does not mean that in the tactic of Parrhēsia itself, in order to obtain one's intended outcome, it may not be necessary from time to time to call upon some elements and procedures belonging to rhetoric. Let's say, Foucault concludes, that Parrhēsia is fundamentally freed from the rules of rhetoric, that it takes rhetoric up obliquely and only uses it if it needs to. End quote. Now, I think that what is interesting is that in the following 2 years, Foucault's analysis of Parrhēsia significantly broadens out. It no longer focuses, as you know, exclusively on the practice of spiritual direction in Roman philosophy and becomes a kind of fully fledged account of the developments of Parrhēsia from classical Greek Athenian democracy up until early Christianity. And as a consequence, his account of the relations between Parrhēsia and rhetoric also undergoes some relevant changes. While maintaining that Parrhēsia as a technique, as a process, and a way of saying things can and frequently must make use of the resources of rhetoric, Foucault now seems more and more interested in emphasizing what neatly differentiates Parrhēsia from rhetoric, and in making clear that Parrhēsia has no specific rhetorical form, and cannot just be defined as an element falling within the province of rhetoric. The crucial difference still seems to lie in the fact that while rhetoric aims to persuade and is indifferent to the truth, it's not so much or necessarily a matter of persuasion in Parrhēsia. This is not an unproblematic claim because Foucault immediately adds, and here I am quoting from the 1983 lecture course of the Government of Self and Others. So Foucault immediately adds that, quote, when Plato gives Dionysus a lecture, he is trying to persuade him. And that it is precisely in this kind of situation, i.e. when Parrhēsia's goal is also persuasion, that he can and must call upon methods of rhetoric. Yet this goal and methods do not define the nature of Parrhēsia. They are not necessary conditions of parrhesiastic utterance, but additional elements that may or may not characterize specific instances of it. Similarly, it is clear that sometimes Parrhēsia takes the form of defiance, of insult, of psychagogy. None of these forms, however, is necessarily tied to it. And Foucault makes it clearer, makes this claim clearer in 1983 and 84. By contrast, what does constitute a necessary condition of parrhesiastic utterance is transparency. Parrhēsia always conveys, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the speaker's thoughts as clearly, as openly, and as possible, and exactly as they are. This is why, in order to depict Socrates as a paradigmatic parrhesiastic figure, Foucault ends up downplaying the importance of what probably constitutes the most famous form that Socrates' discourse takes, namely irony. In his 1982 Grenoble lecture, for instance, Foucault still does not present Socrates as a parrhesiast because he thinks that, quote, there is a structural opposition between parrhēsia and irony. It will not take him long to change his mind on this. In The Government of Self and Others, Foucault portrays Socrates as a parrhesiast, while still emphasizing, quote, that nothing is more distant than parrhēsia from the well-known Socratic or Platonic Socratic irony. In his eyes, parrhēsia remains a veritable anti-irony. Socrates' discourse, in other words, is parrhesiastic, according to Foucault, only when and insofar as it is without embellishment, only when and insofar it directly conveys Socrates' thoughts. It is a discourse that employs the words, I'm quoting Foucault, expressions and phrases which come to mind, one that the person who utters it believes to be true. Foucault further elaborates on these ideas when addressing the Greek notion of logos echimos, that is, of discourse in the naked state, devoid of any embellishment, apparatus, construction, or reconstruction, and therefore a discourse that is closest to the truth. According to the ancient Greeks, Foucault argues, quote, language, words, and phrases in their very reality have an original relationship with truth, since they bring with them what is essential, the truth of the reality to which they refer. Consequently, any addition, transformation, trick, or shift in relation to this original form of language inevitably distances it from the truth. Parrhesiastic discourse, as opposed to rhetoric, is echimos because it is not chosen, fashioned, and constructed in such a way as to produce its effect on the other person, but so bare and simple, Foucault argues, so in keeping with the very movement of thought, that just as it is without embellishment in its truth, it will be appropriate to what it refers to. In short, its transparency ensures that it is able both to tell the truth about reality and to express the soul of the person who utters it. In the first lecture of The Courage of the Truth, 1984, Foucault draws an even more radical distinction between parrhēsia and rhetoric. And I think that it is only here, as I was saying, that it reaches the kind of fully fledged account of their difference. Parrhēsia, he claims, is opposed to the art of rhetoric in every respect. So it came a long way from still what it was saying and writing in 1982. Foucault's way of characterizing this opposition is also importantly different. Rhetoric is no longer said to be indifferent to the truth, but is rather portrayed as indifferent to the relationship between the speaker and what she says. And that's, I think, the kind of crucial shift. For rhetoric does not involve any bond of belief between the person speaking and what she states. Its aim is rather to produce effects in the form of beliefs, convictions, and conducts in the audience so as to establish, Foucault says, a constraining bond between what is said and the person of persons to whom it is said. So Foucault shifts his attention from the kind of traditional idea of rhetoric as indifferent to the truth to the idea of rhetoric's indifference to the relationship between the speaker and their words, and to the fact that the absence or the indifference in rhetoric in relation to this relationship between the speaker and his words corresponds to rhetoric aim to actually create a bond, to create a relationship of persuasion between the speaker's words and the audience way of being, or the audience beliefs and way of being. In other work, I characterize this new perspective that Foucault takes up in 1983 and 1984 more clearly as one that focuses on what J.L. Austin calls the perlocutionary effect, i.e. what is done not in, but by saying something. And of course, I can come back to this point in the Q&A if you want. By focusing on the bonds or the relationship between the speaker and his words and the beliefs of the audience and the effects of the speaker's words on the audience, it becomes easier for Foucault, I want to argue here, to explain why Parrhēsia is the opposite of rhetoric. On the one hand, so this is not necessarily a historical or philological claim that Foucault is doing. I think that this is a philosophical claim, and it must be assumed as such. On the one hand, Parrhēsia entails a strong, manifest, and constitutive bond between the speaker and what she says. On the other, by openly expressing her thoughts, the Parrhēsiast also exposes herself and her bond with the interlocutors to an indefinite risk. In short, I quote Foucault, rhetoric does not entail any bond between the person speaking and what is said, but aims to establish a constraining bond, a bond of power between what is said and the person to whom it is said. Parrhēsia, on the contrary, involves a strong and constitutive bond between the person speaking and what she says, and through the effect of the truth, of the injuries of truth, it opens up the possibility of the bond between the person speaking and the person to whom she has spoken being broken. And this is the kind of perlocutionary perspective. Foucault is now kind of focusing on the effects and on the desired effects of the discourse in terms of the bonds between what is said and the audience. Let's say very schematically, Foucault concludes that the rhetorician is, or at any rate may well be, an effective liar who constrains others. The Parrhēsiast, on the contrary, is the courageous teller of a truth by which she puts herself and her relationship with the other at risk, end quote. This new standpoint thus allows Foucault to find, I think, a clearer way of distinguishing Parrhēsia from rhetoric. Once again, I don't think that this wants to be a historical or philological claim. I think this wants to be Foucault's own philosophical claim about the differences between the two. While rhetoric does not rely on any bond of belief between the speaker and what she says, and aims to establish a bond of power between what is said and the persons to whom it is said, Parrhēsia relies on a constitutive bond between the speaker and what she says, and exposes the speaker, as well as the bond between her and her interlocutors, to a risk in order to try to open the latter's eyes, the interlocutor's eyes, about aspects of their beliefs or conduct that need to be changed. And in this, Foucault is able to kind of locate the critical function of parrhesia, one that is never, one whose kind of concrete effects are never ensured a priori, right? Geoffrey Bennington's claim in a paper from 2016 on parrhesia that Foucault is unable to convincingly distinguish parrhesia from rhetoric, and that it just ends up uncritically endorsing Plato's views about the relations between philosophy, politics, and rhetoric, is therefore, I think, to be rejected. But it is to be rejected if we take into consideration this kind of evolution and these successive shifts in Foucault's own view of the topic. Actually, the pain that Foucault takes to distinguish parrhesia from rhetoric and his explicit valorization of the former of parrhesia as both a paradigmatic form of the philosophical discourse and a genealogical ancestor of the modern critical attitude should give pause to all the scholars who have criticized Foucault for his alleged reduction of truth claims to the power effects they have on their audience, or who have characterized his own critical approach as rhetorical or fictional. In other words, I think that I didn't develop this aspect of the paper here, but the way in which Foucault characterizes the distinction between parrhesia and rhetoric in 1984 by insisting that the rhetorical effects or the effects of power over the interlocutor has to be distinguished from the way in which parrhesia as a form of philosophical discourse operates, I think have broader consequences on other discussions that has been going on about Foucault's own capacity to distinguish truth claims from claims that only have effects of power. I can once again come back to this. Of course, this is a huge topic and a different one. One should go into into the kind of Foucault-Habermas debate and what followed from that. Finally, I think that the pain that Foucault takes in distinguishing parrhesia from rhetoric, and a kind of is successive ways of characterizing this distinction, also clearly show that we should resist any simplistic reduction of the perlocutory dimension of speech to rhetoric, which is the kind of in another literature, the kind of normal and commonplace claim, right? The perlocutory has to do with rhetoric, and that's it. And we should acknowledge instead, with Stanley Cavell, the rich and multifaceted nature of the perlocutory domain, one which, once again, cannot be just reduced to rhetoric, but that has to be considered also as an interesting domain for the philosophical discourse, once again, against what Jürgen Habermas may have claimed. But of course, this is another story. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Daniele, for this meticulous and very thought-provoking presentation. We will now move on to the discussion, and as Marta explained, we would like to start with the other speakers that are also part of the book, so as to promote discussions between the different chapters of the book also, and to see how we react to each other, and then we will move to the other attendees and their questions. So from the speakers, is there any question at this point? Paulo, you may start.
Good morning. Sorry, I had to literally raise my hand because I can't I can't find the button for
I think it's in the reactions section.
Sorry?
It's in the reactions section.
Okay, no, I'll try to find it later.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Daniele. It's a pleasure to hear you. I would like to ask two questions, which are perhaps interconnected. The first one is what do you think about this? I think Foucault is working with two different concepts of rhetoric, and two different concepts which are related to Plato's account of rhetoric in the Phaedrus. So I don't think we should be trying to find a fixed, a hard definition of rhetoric in order to understand what Foucault is doing, and I think that's the way we should try to understand that sort of paradoxical expression by Foucault. How is it like Parisia
non-rhetorical rhetoric?
Yeah. So there's two kinds of concepts. There's two different concepts of rhetoric there, I think. So one which can be an ally of philosophy, and the other is the enemy of philosophy, so to speak. One can be worried about truth, and the other is just worried about the effect that it can provoke on the other. So that's one point. So I totally agree with your claim that Foucault is not trying to confuse philosophy with rhetoric. But my question is it necessary to try to identify a sort of evolution of Foucault's understanding of rhetoric in order to account, in order to refute those perspectives that try to establish that they are trying to say that Foucault is just equating philosophy with rhetoric. And the other question is related to the concept of logos etumos, or transparent logos. This is just one possible translation of the phrase. And my question is this logos etumos really a transparent logos in the sense that it doesn't presuppose anything? Because if we look at what Foucault is trying to do when he's considering ancient Parisia, what he's trying to do is trying to place ancient Parisia in what he what he calls the games of truth, right? So what he's trying to do is trying to identify what is presupposed in this attitude that is apparently an attitude of transparency, but if looked at more attentively, it presupposes a great deal of things. So that's my two questions.
Thank you so much. These are really helpful. In relation to the first one, I think you're right, that there's a way in which we can simply, I mean, I tried to avoid, perhaps in my paper, perhaps I was not entirely successful in doing that. I tried to avoid giving the impression that Foucault's main interest was to give a kind of unique definition of rhetoric. I agree with you. I think it's not what he's doing, and it's not what his interest is. And I do think that, I mean, your suggestion of actually looking at Plato's accounts of the two forms of rhetoric and the relationship with philosophy might definitely help situating what Foucault is doing. At the same time, I think that in 1984, Foucault once again, is not necessarily trying to give an historical account of the relationship between Parrhēsia and rhetoric. I think is trying to give an account of what it considers to be philosophical discourse in the way in which he also perhaps wants to practice it, and a discourse that he calls rhetoric at that point, but that is more, I think, more generally, you know, like any form or any kind of discourse in which the relationship or the bond between the person speaking and her thoughts is not at the center of the activity of speaking. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but at that point, when it does focus on this problem, on the bond or the relationship between, you know, one's words and one's thoughts and the effects of the discourse in terms of creating a bond of persuasion or of power with the other, or like putting the bond that we have at risk in the case of Parrhēsia, I think it is departing from a more traditional way of defining the difference between rhetoric and philosophy, etc., and perhaps trying to find his own way of characterizing that. And perhaps that is the evolution or the change that I wanted to point to, not necessarily, as you were saying, we could say Foucault is working with two concepts of rhetoric. Of course, Parrhēsia will always have a relationship with one kind of rhetoric. There will always be a materiality in the discourse, and we will always use figures of speech, etc., etc. But Foucault in 1984, I think, is no longer really interesting in that. And that was the kind of shift that I was trying to focus on. But I will definitely, when reworking the paper, kind of.
Let me just be a bit more precise in my question. I think you're right when you say that there's a shift, there's an evolution, but there's not a break with what Foucault was thinking previously. That's what I meant.
No,
sort of internal evolution, sort of internal complication of his conception, right?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that this is an important point for me to make clearer in the paper. So, thank you. And I mean, the second question is related with this, right? I mean, the question of the transparent logos, is it really transparent or not? I mean, as I was saying at one point, of course, we should not, I think, just assume that Foucault in 1984 kind of rejected all of these analyses in terms of, you know, power, knowledge, regimes of truth, etc., and just to discover the possibility for the philosophical discourse to be this kind of pure game of truth that is perfectly, you know, like transparent, that doesn't presuppose anything, that doesn't have any kind of effects. The way in which I would characterize this difference, and perhaps this is an aspect that I should try to develop a bit more in the paper, is the idea that the perspective that Foucault takes, and that I kind of describe by using the notion of the perlocutionary, is a perspective in which he now focuses on the problem of the force of truth in ways that allow him to distinguish, I think, more clearly between a first order and a second order normativity between that characterizes his notions of games and regimes of truth. I think that this is something that you can find already in 1980 when he distinguishes games and regimes of truth, and he kind of suggests that if we take the perspective of the games of truth, there is a first order epistemic normativity of what is going on there that doesn't need to rely on relations of power. But every game of truth is still always connected to a regime of truth in which those power relations kind of come into play. And I think that perhaps in his later definition of Parisia and the difference between Parisia and rhetoric, Foucault is kind of implicitly building on that. So that when he talks about truth within Parisia, he's taking the perspective of a game of truth that has its own kind of first order epistemic normativity or ethico-political normativity that can be distinguished from the workings of power. But at the same time, every time that we actually analyze a concrete situation in which Parisia comes to be used, workings of power, dynamics of domination, persuasion, etc., have to come into play again. That's a very, it's a very complex, I think, claim, but I will try to say something more perhaps in the paper about this, because I think it's crucial. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your
that's
answer.
very helpful.
Very clear. Thanks.
Thank you, Fábio.
Hi. So can you hear me? Took me too long to mute myself. Right. Thank you, Daniele. That was very, very interesting and actually very, very stimulating. It's usually the sign of two things: that I'm paying attention and that the paper is good, that I took more notes than usual. I'm a lazy note taker, I must confess. But in this case, my interest overcame my laziness. And one of the things that your paper made me think about was what kind of, if it is possible to match the different definitions, the different conceptions of rhetoric throughout the writings of Foucault with the ancient sources that he was interested in at those specific moments. And this occurred to me when you mentioned, for example, the Roman philosophers and so on, because the rhetoric in imperial Rome as a cultural practice would have been entirely different, or very, very different from rhetoric as practiced in the 5th or 4th century Athens, or even in the 1st century BC in Rome. And the main difference, obviously, it's the kind of political and social organization. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that. My other thought was, how would Foucault fit a practice like protreptic speeches, so the exhortative component of philosophy, in this account of rhetoric? And I have a third point, if I'm allowed, which is has to do with the final definition, or the final stage definition of the difference between rhetoric and parrhesia, is that how does this definition of rhetoric as opposed to parrhesia can account for what I could call the problem of the opinionated ignoramus? So somebody who has an authentic, genuine relationship, attitude towards his or her own beliefs, that has no factual root or support in the truth. So because from the point of view of the attitude, the point of view of the practice, how do you distinguish that from somebody like Socrates, for example, which I assume knew a thing or two, even though he denied it? So I don't know if you'll have time and patience to address these three, but you know.
Great, thank you. These are really helpful. I'm not sure I have so interesting responses for all of them. I think that the first suggestion that you made is really relevant and really important. Foucault's conception of parrhesia, Foucault kind of discovers parrhesia working on sources from the kind of classical Roman period. And it's clear that his own conception, not only of rhetoric, but of parrhesia itself, kind of changes when he kind of broadens his interests and kind of goes back to classical Athens, etc., etc. So I do think that it would be very interesting, and perhaps it would be necessary to do that. That's a huge task, to kind of go back and perhaps try to flag, you know, like the different forms of parrhesia that Foucault is interested in. So the political parrhesia, the philosophical parrhesia, the parrhesia within the care of the self, etc., and kind of try to see if there is a possibility of tracing the different ways in which he then considers rhetoric within that kind of context. I think it's a great suggestion. It's probably something that I should do. I've not done that, so that's why my response is not perhaps so interesting at this point. I hope to have a more interesting response in the final version of the paper. The second question, the kind of the exhortative component of speeches within philosophy. I mean, the way in which I tend, so here there's a more basic question, I think, that is, Foucault sometimes, especially at the end of his life, seems to present parrhesia as a paradigmatic form of the philosophical discourse, but he never kind of says, you know, like it is the only form of the philosophical discourse. So there I would tend to perhaps respond to this in saying Foucault at the end of his life kind of takes, because he's interested in not only in the care of the self and the aesthetics of existence, but is interested in giving a genealogy of the critical attitude and of philosophy as a critical activity. It takes parrhesia as a paradigmatic form of that, but I don't think that he would want to say this is the only form that philosophy can take. So I think there is space, you know, in his account for other components or other aspects of the philosophical discourse. And instead of trying to make the exhortative discourses as parrhesiastic, etc., I think that it is more interesting to try to find out what Foucault found distinctive of parrhesia as an aspect of that discourse. And in terms of your third question, how does the final definition of rhetoric that it gives fits with the kind of opinionated ignorant, or with the with the person who does have a bond of belief between what, I mean, you know, one person can be sincere and still not tell the truth, right? And this is a very interesting question. How do you distinguish between the two? I think that Foucault's point, especially in The Courage of Truth, which kind of introduces, I think, a distinction with what he says apropos the logos ethymos, is that what really matters is the way in which one's own beliefs and lives, etc., are engaged in one's discourse, and that, you know, in a certain way, you know, like it is the kind of ethical political engagement of someone in one's discourse that matters to define parrhesia, far more than what Foucault in Discourse and Truth calls a specific modern worry about, are my beliefs true, right? So of course, it's a huge question there, because it opens up many possible, you know, counterexamples and questions. What do we do with you know, like, I don't know, Trump, who believes is what he says, you know, like, but you know, should we consider him as a parodiast, which is the question that I always get, at least that I used to get when Trump was the president, and you know, it's very complicated, but at least I think that I would go in the direction of there is the kind of relationship between what one thinks, does, and says in Foucault's later conception of parrhesia is primary, and the kind of epistemological modern question of, is that true? Is that really true? You know, like, or not, is secondary, which doesn't mean that it's not important for Foucault. And perhaps the distinction between games and regimes of truth can be used here again. Thanks. I mean, very complex question. I will be happy to talk more about this.
Thank you. Michael Chase, you had a question. I don't know if it was answered in the meanwhile or not.
Well, I think we're sort of running out of time here, but then it was rather a complex question, so perhaps on some other occasion.
Perhaps you can write me an email, or we can, yeah, do it. Thanks.
Marta?
Yes, thank you, Danielle. It was a very instigating talk. I really enjoyed listening to you. My question was actually related to Fábio's second question, so I think you have partially already answered to it, but I would like to insist on a certain point, because I believe it's important in this discussion. I wonder if by emphasizing so much this strong contrast between rhetoric and Parrhēsia, and by characterizing in such a uniform way the truth-telling technique in ancient philosophy, Foucault doesn't somehow neglect the high diversity of styles and genres in which ancient philosophers conveyed their thought, and this is something to which Hadot gives a great importance. And I wonder if this strong contrast between philosophy and persuasion, or between Parrhēsia and persuasion, isn't at odds with some of these forms, like because Foucault seems really to not admit that philosophy might have something to do with persuasion. And when we look at Plato's dialogues, or Epicurus, or Seneca's letters, or the discourses by Epictetus, without, of course, denying their connection to the truth and the fact that they are telling the truth, aren't they also using rhetorical strategies and a particular persuasive form to convey their thoughts? And now, in specific connection with the way Foucault characterizes Parrhēsia as being particularly concerned with creating a bond with the interlocutor, aren't certain rhetorical strategies needed precisely to adapt the speech to that particular interlocutor? So in this sense, is really philosophy so opposed to rhetoric and persuasion, or doesn't it somehow even imply it, at least in this in its ancient form and the particular characteristics we know it has?
Thank you very much. I entirely agree with your way of kind of phrasing the question. I think that we should refrain, though, from attributing to Foucault the idea, once again, that Parrhēsia is the only form of philosophical discourse. I mean, it is the form that Foucault kind of focuses on for a variety of reasons. And I agree that when he, like the 2-3 times that he kind of presents it as the paradigmatic form of philosophical discourse, that is a claim that, from a philological or historical perspective, should definitely be criticized or put into question, right? I mean, I'm not sure that this specific form of the philosophical discourse was the paradigmatic form in antiquity. But what I think is interesting there is that the notion of risk that comes so centrally in Foucault's definition of Parrhēsia in 1983 and 1984, and this idea that the effects of Parrhēsia, or the kind of one of the crucial elements of Parrhēsia is not just transparency, but is transparency related to the acceptance of the risk. So it's related to the fact that the real Parrhēsias, at least the way in which Foucault presents them, are those who accept to take a risk by saying what they think, precisely without adapting their discourse to the interlocutor, right? I mean, it's precisely this kind of form of the philosophical discourse in which there is no need to adapt your discourse to the interlocutor, because the point is you don't want to limit the risk that you're taking by telling the truth, which introduces, I think, a huge kind of split or shift between the analysis that Foucault himself makes of Parrhēsia within the context of the care of the self, and, you know, the master that kind of has to use Parrhēsia in order to guide his directee, and the forms that this takes more within a political context, or, you know, Plato in front of the tyrant, or all of these kind of more belligerent context. So
let me just shortly provoke you also with a comment that Michael Chase has put here in the chat. It is Foucault himself who says that Parrhēsia aims to create also, aims to create this bond with interlocutor. So isn't that contrasting with what you have just said?
But Parrhēsia aims, I mean, what I take Foucault to say is not that Parrhēsia aims to create a bond with the interlocutor. It's the idea that Parrhēsia presupposes a bond with the interlocutor that it puts at risk. So it's the idea, I have a bond with the interlocutor that might take whatever form, and what Parrhēsia is doing is putting that bond at risk because I'm telling the truth. So we are friends, I'm telling you the truth, what I think, and our friendship might suffer from it, something that Foucault says in Discourse and Truth. So it is about the bond that we have with the interlocutor, but while rhetoric tries to create a bond that is a bond of persuasion and of power, Parrhēsia assumes that we are creating a bond because we are talking, and puts that bond at risk because I'm precisely not paying necessarily attention to not offending you, or not telling you, you know, like what is the problem with what you're doing.
And it's just not completely clear to me why I am not at risk if I use some rhetorical strategies. That is, why can't I be sincere, tell the truth, be committed to what I say, have a bond to you, and put that bond at risk, and yet convey that truth in a specific way, in a specific persuasive form, to try to convince you of my truth? Why is persuasion so contrasting with truth and sincereness and this risk-taking? But I could keep discussing for another hour with you, and I know we are.
I agree with you. I mean, just to conclude on that, I mean, I do think that Foucault is pushing this distinction in some of these formulations a bit too far, and I do agree that if we take specific cases of Parrhēsia, the aim of persuasion might still be there, but that's where the kind of the perspective of the perlocutionary comes in, because the perspective of the perlocutionary tells us, well, the effects that I aim to obtain will never be kind of ensured a priori, and the idea is, you know, like if I'm kind of explicitly taking a risk in doing what I am doing, according to Foucault, a rhetorical discourse that doesn't persuade the interlocutor is, in a certain way, in Austin's terms, unfelicitous or unhappy. A parrhesiastic discourse that even uses some persuasive techniques is not unhappy if it doesn't persuade the interlocutor, because the point of Parrhēsia is not persuasion per se. So you kind of have this difference, you know, through Austin, in which you can say, well, sure, you can have two discourses that are basically the same, but their conditions and their effect. I mean, one can be unhappy, the other can be happy, even if they obtain the same result. And that's perhaps the way to go to try to distinguish the two. But thanks. I mean, I will keep thinking about this topic.
Thank you very